Hi, this is Mark Gaylor. Welcome to my second live broadcast. Okay, I'm talking to you from a sunny Melbourne on one of the last summer days here in Australia. It's going to a top of 33 degrees, which is 91 degrees Fahrenheit for you guys over in the USA. Okay, so I've got a lot to talk about today. I've had a busy February. I've been testing the A6400 Sony camera, and although not everybody's going to rush out and buy this camera, it does offer some significant changes, which we'll see rolled out over every new model. And some of the models, such as the A7 III, A7R3, and the A9, are also going to see firmware updates in March and April. So I really wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about those. Now, we didn't have a great deal of success with the chat pod in the session one. I'm hoping I'll get a little bit more success this time. Okay, if I can't see the questions in the chat pod, I will answer all questions after this session ends. I did notice two questions in the forum just before starting, and so I'll just address those before we go any further. Okay, somebody said, does it matter if you switch off audio when shooting stills? And I've never done that. It's not really impacted on any of my photography. I don't really see why it would impact on shooting stills when we're shooting audio. Typically, audio is a very useful feature, even if we don't use the camera's audio, which is obviously very low quality for video. But it's if you're recording separate audio to a separate device, that audio, the camera's audio, is a great a resource to be able to synchronize the separate audio. Typically, when I'm recording audio to my camera, I'm using a little Sony Bluetooth on the multi-port shoe on the top of the camera, the hot shoe, and the audio from my lapel mic or lavalier just goes straight into the audio file. If I'm not using that, I'm using a shotgun mic, a Rode shotgun mic with an audio in cable going into the side of the camera. I do know Sony makes some shotgun mics where you don't have to plug a cord in; it just has to be attached to the hot shoe of the camera. Okay, so let's take a look at some things. I'll just share my screen. I wanted to go through some images that I've been capturing with the 6400 and use those as a talking point. Oh yeah, one of the other questions I got, I almost got sidetracked there, was if I could only choose one lens. Hopefully I'll never actually have to do that. I mean, the great thing about choosing an interchangeable lens camera is that we can, it's almost like changing our clothes for different climates. We choose a particular lens for a particular job. And one of the problems for me choosing one lens is I choose to shoot an eclectic assortment of subjects, from wildlife, action, landscape, editorial, documentary, portraiture. So one lens is a really hard choice. If you're thinking that you could only choose one lens, I suppose most people would choose to shoot with a zoom lens, maybe a 7x zoom, like the one on the A6400, which I've been enjoying using, is the 18-135. It's pin sharp throughout the range. If you were being super critical at the wide angle range, you would the focal length, you would probably notice the corners are not pin sharp, but pin sharp in the center, and the bokeh isn't the best. Obviously, it's not a wide aperture prime, and just the shape of the bokeh isn't perhaps can't compete with some of my short telephoto primes, such as the 85 GM and just the 85 1.8. I think if I had to choose one lens, a lot of my work does get done with the 85mm prime, either the 1.8 or the 1.4. And so I think if I was choosing one lens, maybe it would be the 85mm prime. Okay, so let's, I'll just see if I can share my screen. There's always going to be a little bit of a hiccup while I do this, so just bear with me. You're going to see a mirrored view, presumably, while I do that. Okay, so let's just, let's see if I can share. And I'll just hide that. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing my desktop screen. You should see me in the top right-hand corner. And I've got a chat pod in the bottom right hand side, you might want to just type something in there so I know I'm not talking by myself. If I don't see anything appear, I'll presume that there are still people in the forum, just the chat pod isn't working again. And maybe I'll look at that for the third live session. Okay, you can see on my desktop screen there, I've just been to Hong Kong for Sony. It was an event held for Sony employees, people who design, manufacture, market, and sell the Sony glass. And the Sony lens division really is matching the camera division almost on total sales. So it's a very important area of growth. And I think one of the great achievements of Sony over recent times is their ability to prove to the photographic community that they're more than capable of designing premium glass. Obviously, Sony used a lot of premium designs from Zeiss. We saw a lot of Zeiss badges on the front of lenses or on the side of lenses, typically the 55 and 35mm primes that came out with the original A7 mirrorless cameras were both Zeiss design lenses. We haven't seen a Zeiss design lens for quite a while now. The premium glass is coming out as GM glass or G glass, and some of that GM glass is certainly some of the most fabulous glass you can get for these mirrorless systems. So let's take a look at some of the slides from Hong Kong. I did want to showcase some of the things I was shooting there, not just to showcase the A6400, but also to show you a couple of the behind-the-scenes shots that I've been shooting and give you a rundown of how I decide to organize, compose, and maybe even do a little bit of post-production on those images. So I've got a little folder here that I'll just open out, and let's see if we can take a look at those images. First, I'll go into the AF tracking. Okay, so let's just, I'll just push that into the corner of my window so you can still see me and I can still see the chat pod there. Okay, first off, one of the things that I was slightly frustrated with, let's say, was at the A6400 launch in the USA on the West Coast, I believe. There were the typical big names invited to those launch, typically vloggers who have got more than 500,000 followers. Sony did run a PowerPoint prior to the shooting experience showing the settings. But it became quite clear to me, looking at some of those reviews, not all the vloggers then implemented the advice in that PowerPoint. There were Sony staff on hand to help people get the best possible performance out of the cameras. Now, whenever you're dealing with action, moving targets, obstacles that momentarily come between you and the subject, the choice of settings is critical to the success. One of the things that I enjoyed seeing about the A6400 firmware is how much easier it is to choose settings that will be very sticky to your subject. You don't have to change settings typically in between or while you're shooting a particular subject, because the background subject changes, obstacles come into view. Typically, I would, with any of the Sony Alpha cameras, I would move between a choice of 6 different AF areas. There is no one best AF area for shooting action sports. And there is another group of settings that often need to be selected to get the best possible performance from these cameras, or any camera for that instance. It's not just a matter of just choosing one setting. Now, I've just been creating and have just published an ebook for the A6400, and in the new features section, that's probably more than 50 pages long, I'm going down through the menu items. So even though you may have no intention of buying a 6400, those 50 pages will show you probably what you'll enjoy on the next Alpha camera that you do purchase. So it could be offer a broader resource for the Alpha community rather than just 6400 users. One of the things that I should also mention is a lot of people are asking, okay, should I upgrade to the 6400 from the 6500? And I do need to point out that the 6400 is not an upgrade for the 6500. The camera doesn't have steady shot inside, or IBIS, in-body image stabilization. And if that in-body image stabilization is important to you, i.e. you shoot with slow shutter speeds in low ambient light, maybe handheld landscape, then maybe you should just wait for the upgrade to the 6500. And no, I don't know when the upgrade for that 6500 is coming out, but there was a statement just a few days ago from Sony in Japan saying that they, 2019, the APS-C community, the A6000 series community, is going to see some significant releases during 2019. And I would expect at least one more APS-C camera, maybe the upgrade to the 6500, and also some additional lenses. I would really like to see a sporting lens, because these 6400 camera is certainly up to shooting sports action. The only thing that I was ever so slightly critical of in my 1 hour review of the camera was the buffer capacity is a little bit limited. It's less than half the buffer capacity of the 6500. So yes, you can shoot 40 images before the camera slows down, but when the camera does slow down, it writes those images quite slowly to the buffer. So it is going to lock you out for maybe a minute or two while that process happens. Okay, so really what I would expect with an upgrade to the 6500, as well as having the in-body image stabilization, is also seeing the buffer of maybe the 6500, which is over 100 raw shots, and maybe a very fast card slot like we've seen on the A7 III, the A7R3, and the A9 cameras that can clear that buffer very quickly. I've just seen from Maggie White that I'm very pleased my chat pod's working. It's very good. It's a little bit disconcerting when you think you're just talking to your computer screen and no one's listening to you. So hi Maggie, it's good to see you online. Okay, so let's. So my first slide really is just to show you the settings. Now, with all of my settings, when I recommending people group these settings and put them into a memory. Now, on the memory dial on the top of the A6400, it just now says MR. It doesn't say 1, 2, and if you had an A7R3 or A9, a 3, it basically you just dial in the MR, and then you get to choose from a submenu whether you want 1, 2, or 3, or whether you want to pick up one of the M settings from the memory card, because you can save additional 4 groups of settings on the memory card. Those are deleted when you reformat the card, but you can actually back those M1 to M4 settings up on a computer screen. Now, what I am, and I'm slightly getting distracted again, is the one of the things that I would highlight when using these memory settings is they're just a starting point. A lot of people are very thankful to see me share my memory settings, but they're just a starting point. I'm not locked in to just shooting in this one group of settings for all action sports. So really, I just wanted to take a little bit of time just talking you through these. Now, a lot of people shoot action sports in shutter priority, but I choose aperture priority, not shutter priority. And one of the reasons for that, there's a couple of reasons, but one of the reasons is on some of the cameras, such as the A7R3, if you drop below f8, then you cut out the phase detect autofocus. It locks focus on the first frame and then doesn't carry on tracking through the subsequent frames. That's F11 on the A9 and the A7 III. I've heard reports in the March firmware update for the A9 that's going to be moved to F16. I haven't found any information on the aperture limit for the A6400. Sony are basically not broadcasting that figure. And I haven't had really time to check that out at the moment, so I'll get back to the community if I find out that there is an aperture limit. Typically, however, I would tend to shoot with a wider aperture to freeze motion, and then maybe stop the aperture down if I want to create a movement blur when I'm panning the camera. So let's just run through aperture starting, f4 to freeze. Some of the zoom lenses you can't open up as far as f4, but one of the lenses that I do like using with these crop sensor cameras is the 70 to 200 f4G lens. It is a full frame lens, but I'm absolutely confident that this lens can keep up with the super fast AF of cameras such as the 6300, 6400, 6500. I do own a little 55-210, which is really nice. It's a little crop sensor telephoto zoom, but I'm not absolutely convinced that it can keep up with the focus speed of the cameras, which is why I moved to that 7200. It's a white full frame lens. It's not the GM. I didn't want to use the GM because it's quite an expensive and large lens. And one of the lenses that I'm hoping Sony releases in 2019 for the crop sensor cameras is an equivalent 7200 for these crop cameras. It should come out at half the physical size and weight of the full frame and be a little bit cheaper. So I'm looking forward to that if Sony make one. Okay, so ISO, typically I'll work with auto ISO. And this is where I can work with aperture priority with sports action, is I need to work with ISO auto minimum shutter speed. It tends to be buried in the menus, so I would recommend that if you're going along this route that you assign it to the function menu. I actually assign it to a custom button on the full frame cameras. I am using this all of the time, and so I've parked it on the C1 button on my full frame cameras. This allows me to stop the camera from going below, say, 1/2000th per second if I'm trying to freeze fast moving action, and if I need background blur, then I'll slow that down to 1/250th. Now these are only recommended, or the camera tries to achieve these minimum shutter speeds, but when the ambient light is very low, the camera will prioritize exposure and not the shutter speed. A couple of people have seen me recommending these minimum shutter speeds, and they say their camera is registering 1/30th of a second. And I basically tell those people, you need to take the camera outside in brighter ambient light. You may be setting the camera up at night in your studio, and you're not going to hit that 1/2000th of a second in very dark ambient light. And that's because the camera is trying to protect your exposure. And the camera can't go higher than your maximum ISO that you've set in auto ISO setting. So, but if you're out in the in bright ambient light, then the camera will hit the 1/2000th of a second if it can do that. Okay, so so the shutter speed is really not applicable when I'm shooting sports action on aperture priority. I'll be choosing the continuous shooting high. Now, we do get high plus on all cameras except the A9. The high plus really is the very fast frame rate. That's 10 or 11 frames per second. Okay, but it doesn't give live view panning. And a couple of the times I've seen some of these reviewers at the Sony events reviewing the action sports capabilities with high plus selected, and they're not going to be super accurate when panning because they're not getting a live view. So we do need to select high in those instances to slow those cameras down just a touch. We're probably going to hit 8 frames per second on the A7R3, the A7 3 cameras when shooting in high, but that is giving us the live view. Continuous AF, obviously. One of the reviewers was caught out with AFA, which is supposed to switch between stills and continuous, and that's a really not a good setting. That automatic switching between continuous focusing and single shooting mode is not that reliable on most cameras, whether it's Nikon, Canon, Sony, and I'm not too sure why the reviewer in America chose to start with that setting, given they're not really reliable on any camera. and so it wasn't really fair to report that the focus tracking wasn't great when the camera probably wasn't focus tracking at all. Okay, so the next one is tracking. The 6400 is the fabulous new feature, is a firmware feature. The camera body is essentially an A6300 with a flip-up screen from the 5100. Now, the tracking has replaced the lock-on AF options, and this is really where the camera shines. For me, it's not a vlogger's camera, it's a sports camera, or an entry-level camera where people just want to shoot their kids playing soccer or their dog running on the beach. This is really where this camera is going to shine, because this camera is perhaps the most reliable camera at shooting moving targets. If you don't want to spend the money for an A9 or a Nikon D5. Okay, so now I'm recommending going for wide. Wide is a very reliable AF area tracking wide. It's generally going to pick up your subject very easily. The only times that it might choose the wrong subject is if your subject is buried in amongst other obstacles, other subjects, other targets, such as if you are tracking your child playing soccer, the camera would lock on to a random soccer player rather than your particular, your son or your daughter playing the soccer. So this is probably where you want to move down to a smaller focus area like zone or expand flexible spot, so you can target one subject and the camera will then follow. The reason I suggest wide first is it means that you don't have to try and position a small focus point on the subject, because 90% of the time a dog running on the beach is the only subject that the camera will pick, and so it's going to be the most reliable at picking the target very accurately. Now, I did notice on my pre-production A6400, pre-AF was in the on position. Now, all other alphas that I've taken out of boxes, it's in the off position. So I'm not too sure whether this was just a pre-production hiccup, or whether Sony have decided that's what they want to do with this new camera. So I often found when I first went out to shoot these dogs on the beach, and you can see one of them in this slide, is I wasn't absolutely sure that the camera was doing a good job of picking up a subject, because as soon as I raised the camera, it seemed to have locked onto something already, and that is the pre-AF feature. It locks on before you even press an AF on button or half press the shutter release. And so I immediately went into the menus, because I'm aware of that function of Sony cameras, and switched it off, so that I get to choose when the camera starts tracking, rather than have the camera randomly picking random subjects. And I suspect that maybe some of the reviewers also encountered that problem with the cameras that they were testing in the US. Okay, so one of the reviewers who often gets invited to these Sony launches often claims that these cameras don't hit the 10 or 11 frames per second that Sony claims. And that is because that reviewer is going into the menu items and overriding one of the settings, and it's the AFC priority, which is normally set to an average, not focus, not release. If you want the full maximum frame rates, you should set AFC priority to release. And that means you'll get the full 10 or 11 or 8 frames per second in the high mode from the camera you're testing. The manufacturer isn't trying to deceive you, but if you're not shooting all of the frames because the camera is only shooting the ones it's absolutely certain are sharp, then you're not going to get that full frame rate, but release will give you that full frame rate. And 9 times out of 10, they're all sharp anyway. So there isn't a lot of point setting that balanced emphasis or the AF, because in my experience is when the camera is locked on, all of the shots are sharp anyway. Okay, so choosing a lens with a wide aperture is also a great secret to success when shooting this fast action. So choosing any lens with an aperture of f4 or wider. And again, I've had great success with the 85mm full frame lens on these cameras, and also the 7200, the G lens there. The other thing that I would point out is if you are shooting action sports, the real-time IAF is permanently on now, because face priority is switched on by default. Occasionally in sports action where you've got people behind your primary subject, if your target turns their head, normally the alpha cameras would then just jump to the nearest eye or face that it found. The new technology with the real-time tracking doesn't do that. It stays with your primary subject even though it can't see the eye, and this is a great step forward. But in some instances, I may still want to switch face priority off if I'm a little bit nervous that the camera might jump from my primary target because the head or face or eye is momentarily obscured. Okay, so those are my settings. I wanted to go through now and just show you how sticky this camera is. If you look at the second row, extreme left-hand side, you'll see this hip-hop dancer has the arm completely in front of their face, and the camera carries on tracking the head, not the arm. A lot of cameras without lock-on or without this new tracking feature would jump to the nearest bit of subject in the AF area. And so you'd have to have a small spot on the head to avoid the camera jumping to the arm. This was basically tracking the eye, even though the hip hop dancer was just jumping very rapidly around. And as you can see from this particular shot, these are pages taken from my A6400 book, you can see quite clearly the focus is still on the head. So it's lost the eye, it hasn't panicked, it hasn't jumped ship, it's tracking the nearest thing to the eye, which was the head, not the arm, which appears momentarily. Now, I've posted a whole series of these sequences. They're not really my hero shots. It just shows you when people walk in front of my primary target or move in front, the camera isn't phased by this behavior. And to see some of the reviewers in the US having problems just means that they really didn't have the camera set up, because time and time again, this camera performed admirably. Top right, you can see that even though there's a whole head in front of my primary target, the camera tracks the ear that's left on the head that is still visible, and then immediately snaps back to the eye as soon as the obstacle clears from view. Okay, so those are the tracking that I wanted to look at. Let's just I'll just collapse this box, and then let's move forward to a portrait shoot that I was working on in Hong Kong. So let's just work on this. Okay, so let's take a look at this one. Okay, so this one, you're not supposed to see any subject here. This is me scouting a location for a portrait shoot I was about to do on the beach with the Sony employees. And I'm just scouting with just a general zoom lens, but I'm looking at what the bokeh might look like behind my given vantage point on this beach. And I actually chose the bokeh at the back of the beach, which was a blue painted house. I actually just like the pattern and shapes of the bokeh. And as an alternative view there, I looked at maybe some bokeh balls coming through leaves on trees, and you can see the bokeh balls there, top right of the image coming through. So that was maybe an alternative. When you're using a wide aperture prime, wide open, you're really not going to see much of what the background is. You're just creating a pleasing background for your hero subject. Okay, we returned the next day with, and I started doing little demos, and everybody in the got a chance to shoot the model on the beach. So the first consideration, it was a beautiful sunny day, but beautiful sunny days isn't great for location portraiture. Often harsh sunlight can be very unflattering for the complexion. You get harsh shadows coming across the face. And so what I decided to do, and I usually travel with one of these diffusers, was just to put up a diffuser. I got one of the participants. This is a guy called Han, who's putting up a diffuser, and we can see what that does is it just allows the sunlight to pass through the diffuser and create this beautiful soft flattering light. You don't need flash. Once you've got the sun out, you can just diffuse the actual sunlight and basically solar power for creating the beautiful lighting we see on this beach scene here. Okay, so the model's beautiful, the lighting is beautiful, the background is beautiful. So the next step that we do is looking at combining those. Now, the model Eva is looking off towards one of the other participants here, but I just wanted to grab a shot to, and this is something I said to the participants, the biggest compositional tool that they have now is their vantage point in relation to the model. Just taking one step to the left, one step to the right will change the nature of the bokeh. Standing up or kneeling down on the ground will also change one of the major compositional elements to the frame, and that is the division between the beach and the background. We've got a strong edge there, and typically if you're at the same height of the model, this very strong edge or line will pass through the model's head. So one of the things that I chose to do is just take a slightly lower vantage point. As I get a little bit lower, that design element, the line or edge, could be a horizon line, will go a little bit lower as well. And so you can see here I've got an image inside of Lightroom CC. This is not the classic version. This is the mobile version, which is often I work with when I'm on location or traveling very light. You can see that stronger element now goes down below through the shoulders. It's a little bit darker than I want. I'm just playing a little bit safe on the exposure here. Maybe I've just dialed the exposure compensation down to -1/3 or -2/3 of a stop. I want to make sure that I'm protecting the highlight values. We've got sunlight hitting almost a white sand beach there. So just lowering the exposure just to make sure I don't clip or overexpose those highlights is my primary concern here, knowing that I can just push the exposure a little bit higher in post-production. Here we've raised it half a stop just to put a little bit more light back into the scene, and I'm still protecting the highlights there. If I'm not protecting the highlights and I'm shooting in RAW, I'll just lower the whites slightly or bring down the highlight slider slightly just to protect and feed more information into those highlights. Sometimes if there's an unbalance between the background and my primary subject, I might just drop in a radial filter with a positive exposure. That area of red shows you that I'm adding another 4/10 of a stop of light over Eva's face there, just to create a nice final exposure for Eva, as we can see there. The eyes are drawn to the light, so generally you want Eva's face to maybe just be as bright as the beach in the background, or maybe even a little bit brighter. And I'll typically add a little bit of a vignette so we could just darken off those bright corners of the beach in the foreground there. So this is really just was to showcase how I would approach shooting a portrait on location with a wide aperture prime, and I was using the 85mm GM lens here, but the cheaper 1.8 is more than up to the job of creating that what I call figure ground separation. This is a way of really separating out and making the figure pop from the background. And I do like to create dynamic portraits by simplifying the amount of information in my portraits there. So that's where we started with the original Scout, and you can see where I ended up with my final portrait. Let's just I'll close that down. I'll start looking at some other shots here that I captured while I was in Hong Kong. First off, this one I was using the 24 GM lens on the 6400. I didn't think I was really in the market for a wide aperture, wide angle lens. It is harder to get figure ground separation unless you're very close to your primary targets with these wide angle lenses. But when I was at a Sony event and picked up the 24 GM, I was very impressed of how unheavy it was, how light it is, and I do like light portable lenses. So I put my hands up to do a long-term review of this lens. So I went out at night time with the 6400, took the 24, decided I would just leave it at maximum aperture and see whether the camera could track faces at night. And pleasingly, it was tracking faces, and occasionally, not all of the time, I hasten to add, it would actually pick up an eye and start tracking that. I have to say it was incredibly dark. We're looking at an exposure of 6,400 ISO with an aperture of 1.4, so that sort of gives you an idea of how dark it was on these street scenes, and you can also get an idea of how dark it was just by the fact that this young woman's phone is illuminating her face. Now, I just wanted to go through and take a look at, let's just go back the other way. Okay, so this is the actual out of camera exposure. We're getting a lot of artificial light now, and the camera on auto white balance decided it would create this sort of yellowy looking image. And if we go back, you can see in post-production, I've just lowered the color temperature. And I haven't actually added any blue on this woman's face. It just allowed the natural cool light coming from the phone to give you that blue-orange balance there, which is typically what I was looking for. And this really highlights the light coming from the phone more effectively than the camera's auto white balance that we can see there. It's amazing the degree of subtlety that we can fail to pick up just through white balance. There is actually some very cool light coming from that phone, but it's almost completely invisible. Just remember that for white balance for RAW shooters, it's just a reference. Occasionally I will set a custom white balance, but most of the time I just leave the camera in auto white balance, knowing I can move that color in post-production with no damage to the file whatsoever. Okay, so let's take a look at this was captured just a few weeks before I went to Hong Kong. It's at a demonstration in Melbourne, and this one, and it comes back to one of those original questions: if I could only choose one lens, what would it be? And this one, I decided to go out to this event just taking one lens. Now, typically, if you're going out to record or document an event, you would, most people, including myself from years past, I would take a wide angle lens, maybe a 28 or 35 mil equivalent, to get that broader angle of view to show you the crowds and what was happening. And then maybe a short telephoto to go and pick out some hero characters within that story. In this particular instance, I decided to go to the event not with multiple lenses. I just decided to take one lens only, which is the 85 GM. And the other thing that I decided to do to make it more difficult for myself is I decided only to use maximum aperture f1.4. Now, one of the reviewers, again, that's invited to these Sony launches, claims he gets a 60% IAF hit rate with cameras like the A7 III and A7R III. And I really can't fathom out why that hit rate is so low, because my hit rate for IAF when I'm shooting at these type of events and subjects are moving, I'm moving, and I'm getting at least 90%, possibly much higher hit rate on IAF, and this highlights that instance as well. And going back to the shots of Eva, this is the whole time frame compressed rapidly here, but I tend to just do this in on autopilot now. Is look at the bokeh, find the subject, look at the best angle of view to get the best bokeh, then work out whether I need to raise the camera a bit higher or maybe stoop a little bit lower to get the best possible bokeh behind the subject, trying to avoid sky behind the subject. This character is actually backlit. It's another sunny day. I wouldn't choose to photograph either in harsh sunlight, but at these type of events, you don't get a lot of choice. So I tend to be very busy running around subjects, looking at getting the best possible angle of view, not just only for bokeh, but also light falling on the faces. I often refer to this as the photographic dance, the need for the photographer to move in relation to their subject to get that best possible figure ground separation. And we can see the focus is extremely accurate on this. Again, you can see from my exposure slider on the right there that I've raised one stop. Because it's a sunny day, you'll see that typically my highlights have a negative value, -50. My shadows have a positive value, +50. That would tend to be a starting point for me when I'm shooting in high contrast situations. I've got auto import presets that just will basically punch in those settings, because when you're photographing in high contrast situations, raising the shadows and bringing down the highlights is pretty much going to happen on every image. I also throw in a positive contrast. When I've pulled highlights down a lot and opened shadows up a lot, I also add in a little bit of clarity and also a little bit of contrast. Otherwise, we get this faux HDR, unnatural look to the images. So yes, I want more detail in the highlights and shadows, but I still want good mid-tone contrast, which is the reason I'm using a positive contrast value when editing these images. Okay, so underexposing in capture again, and that again is the reason I can see some very bright highlights in the background, and I don't want those to clip. One of the things that I love about the full frame sensors is their ability to restore shadow values that are underexposed. The optimum quality is achieved by leaning the exposure to the right when we can, but we can only do that when lighting or subject contrast is low. So a lot of the time in high contrast subject matter like sunlight, I am lowering the exposure to protect highlights. And you can see it looks a little bit dark when I have lowered those exposures. You can see from the histogram top right that I'm only just getting those bright highlights into the overall exposure. One of the things that I tend to always photograph with is a histogram in the electronic viewfinder, the finder, or on the monitor. So I can always basically just refer to that just to make sure that I'm not clipping the highlights. I'm always trying to protect those highlights. I'm often don't notice that I'm actually glancing at it. It's a bit like a rear vision mirror in a car. You don't know how often you use it until you turn it away from the road behind you and realize you're actually glancing at it every 30 seconds or more. And typically, well, I'm hoping you are. And typically, this is what I'm doing with the histogram. Histograms tend to be a little bit pessimistic in the cameras because they're sort of thinking that you're writing JPEGs with the creative style settings that you've got dialed into your camera and not writing RAW. So you got a little bit more headroom if you are a RAW shooter. Okay, so the next image I really wanted to discuss was one of the shoots that we did in Hong Kong. This is not my image, but this was a reference image for the location we were going to be taken to. Now, it's often referred to as the Transformer building in Hong Kong. I believe it featured in a Transformers movie, not that I ever saw it, but you can see this congestion of living space in Hong Kong, and it creates quite a dramatic view. It's very, very well visited now. I got some people saying how creative I was in choosing this location, and that is not actually the case. This location was chosen for me by Sony. Um, I really like this time of day, but unfortunately, Sony also chose the itinerary when we would be going to these locations, and so the time of day we got there was a lot more challenging for the participants, and my job was to help everybody go away with at least one good image from this location. So I'd quickly run through my settings, make sure that every participant had got that set up, and then my next group would arrive in another 15 minutes or so. So this is one of the outcomes from my shoot. Now that sky is incredibly bright. And so what I realized was none of the participants was actually, if they protected the highlights by lowering the exposure, the actual building structure would be completely dark, a complete silhouette. We were looking at a very extreme contrast range. Now, I always claim the dynamic range of the Sony cameras is absolutely amazing, but this was extreme. So what I decided to do was to show the auto HDR feature for the JPEG users, where the camera would just automatically create a HDR image in camera, or the manual settings for the RAW shooters, which was to bracket. And what I elected to do, because it was so extreme, sometimes I might only bracket 3 or 5 exposures, but in this instance, I bracketed 9 shots. I got Lightroom to merge the HDR, and then I had to come in and add some shadow value. You can see I've taken the shadows up to +90 here, and the exposure are 1 1/3 stops. So you can see this was an incredibly high contrast situation, and the only way of combating this was just to come back at a time of day where the sky was not so bright. And that would obviously be towards dusk, when the apartment lights would come on, lighting the courtyard, and the sky would be 3, 4, 5, 6 stops darker, and we'd get that balance between exposure. When choosing locations for landscapes, that's typically what we're doing. We tend to be photographing early in the day, first light of day or last light of day, or even before the sun has come to the horizon, to get that balance of exposure between sky and foreground. One of the things, there's the original exposure after the HDR merging, so you can see how extreme that was. Okay, so the Lightroom does kick out a raw file, and we can recover those shadows in post. One of the things that I also did is getting the optimum angle of view to this in the absolute center of the courtyard was slightly compromised by a small tree in the courtyard. So being slightly off center just created this non-symmetrical vantage point that created, obviously it's a little bit upsetting for the obsessive compulsive. Some of the horizontals and verticals weren't absolutely bang on. So what I did was I took out the corrected HDR image, the one that I'd raised the exposure for the shadows. I opened that up inside of Photoshop, and what I did was I converted that into a smart object. Okay, and then I applied a free transform. That would be Command T on a Mac, Control T on a PC, and then I'm going in and just tweaking the shape of that. Now, in the options bar on the free transform, you'll get the option to sort of break it up. I can't remember the terminology of it now, sorry. I'll probably remember it after I finish this session. Is it breaks the image up into like 9 segments, and you can basically fine tune the shape of your layer by moving on any points of the grid, and then just hit the return enter key when you transform that, hit save. The edited image will come back into Lightroom, and that's the image I uploaded to Flickr as my 4K ultra high definition. Some people think when I refer to 4K, I'm referring to movies. I'm actually just referring to pixel dimensions, 4K being 3,840 pixels on the longest dimension, which is what 4K screens, whether it be a desktop monitor or your 4K TV, can show with maximum quality. Okay, so I'm just keeping an eye on the time there. We're 3/4 of the way through. If you do have a question, I've only got one thing open in the chat pod, which is from Maggie. So if you do have a question, just type it in now, because we will enter a small Q&A session. As I said, if last time I saw the questions was when I finished the chat, so if I do find some questions in the chat pod after I've recorded this movie and made this movie live to members, I will answer all of those questions as I go through, and I do one of these live chats every month. Just try and get your questions in onto the post before we go live, and that way I will pretty much guarantee that you get your question answered. I am going to prioritize questions from members as my following grows, and I can't answer every question on every YouTube movie. I am going to prioritize the members. Okay, so that sort of runs through the folio images that I really wanted to discuss here today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to end the sharing of the screen. Stop sharing. Okay, so you should see just me now, not my screen anymore. Thank you for joining me again. We're sort of 50 minutes into this session, so I'll just check the chat pod. I'll make sure that that we've got no questions coming in, and if there's no questions, I will finish off a little bit early. But if you've got any questions, I'll make additional posts onto the community channel for members only, to give members the maximum opportunity to ask questions. And I might just create an open Q&A forum in between movies, so that you get your questions answered in a timely manner. Okay, so very exciting period. 2019 should be a great period for Sony. Obviously, Sony are not don't enjoy the full frame mirrorless market to themselves anymore, and I did put out a sort of a comparison movie. A couple of comments, wanted to basically claim I was a Sony fanboy for just mentioning facts. I just wanted to be tried to be as accurate as possible. I did actually think that the specs and the quality coming from the Nikon Z7 was very good, and I know it sort of sounds like a backhanded compliment, but I said it was almost as good as the A7R2, and that's pretty much what has happened with the other camera manufacturers coming into the full frame market. I think that they were looking at the A7 II camera when they started designing their full frame mirrorless, and they are a little bit behind. I think Canon's biggest challenge is they're also a generation or two generations behind in sensor design. I think one of the interesting areas for imaging is not just sensor design. I'm really looking forward to stacked backlit illuminated sensors being rolled out in more cameras, just rather than just being in the A9 camera, being rolled out in more of the alpha range. But I'm also interested in that computational imaging, which is happening in the smartphone space, and we see a little bit of that coming into the A6400. It's using some machine learning, it's sometimes referred to as AI, artificial intelligence, to help the cameras find the subject and stay with the subject. This does require much faster processing power of the cameras. And one of the issues I do have to take up with Sony is Sony have been calling their processors inside these cameras now a Bionz X processor. Now, the first processors that came out with the very first A7 cameras was called a Bionz X processor, and the super fast processor in the A9 camera is also called a Bionz X processor. It doesn't distinguish the performance speed differences between those processors. Maybe the architecture is very similar, but the processing speed of the A9 processor is very fast. Sony don't list the processing speed. When we go out buying a computer, we're looking at a clock speed, 4 gigahertz, 2 gigahertz. We're looking at a quad core, dual core. We're not giving that information from the processors going into the cameras. I'm not sure any camera manufacturers do, actually, so maybe I'm being a bit unfair for Sony here. But it does lead some people to saying, why am I not getting those super fast tracking features in my A7 III? I'm going to get the real-time IAF, I'm going to get the animal IAF, but why am I not going to get the object tracking? And I think it just comes down to maybe the processor in those cameras isn't fast enough to do the AI, the real-time processing of that information in those cameras. And I suspect that it's not Sony holding back. Sony's never really been a company to hold back. Sometimes they're a bit slow in the firmware upgrades, but I'm hoping that Sony's turned a new leaf in 2019 with that, and we're going to see some more generous firmware upgrades coming across the camera systems. Maggie's just asked another question there. Is there a date for the firmware update for the A7R III? Yes, there is. It's listed as April. We don't have a specific day in April, but what we're going to get for the A7 III, the A7R III is real-time IAF. What that means is you won't have to hold down a custom button for IAF to be constantly on. And in some instances, a lot of people have got a custom button program to IAF. Now, what my initial recommendation would be to program face priority to that button, or have face priority assigned to the function menu, because there are going to be instances where you want to switch off IAF for one reason or another, because it's picking up an eye in a face rather than maybe the horse you're tracking, and you want to switch off the face priority so it switches off in turn the IAF. So having it on all the time is great, but there are going to be instances, very few, but there are going to be instances where you want to disable it, and you want to be able to get to that ability to disable IAF quite quickly. So I've had face priority assigned to my function menu since forever. It's not there by default, strangely, but I would certainly put that into your function menu if you haven't already done so. Okay, so we're getting a March update for the A9. Now, the A9 update is going to be very comprehensive. We're looking at least 50 new features there. And if you want to see what a lot of those features are, again, just download the free A6400 ebook. It just jumped to the new features section. Pretty much, I guarantee whatever you see in that new features section is going to be a modified menu item for every new camera. And hopefully some of those features, like I think the time lapse, the intervalometer, is going to roll back to the A7R III and the A7 III, because that's not processor dependent. And that is going to allow you to shoot raw images using the electronic shutter for a time lapse, and then use the Imaging Edge application, Sony's application, to assemble that time lapse movie in post. You can do it in using partly Lightroom and then move over to Photoshop as well, but the Imaging Edge is free, and if you don't have the CC subscription, then that is just Sony allowing you to do this in post-production without having to buy software. Okay, so some people say, well, I want the camera to make the movie, and the cameras can already make time-lapse movies. And just go over to the S&Q, slow and quick feature of the cameras, and use the set the preference for the frame rate. Typically, I've got 100 frames per second dialed into my slow and quick feature, and that's for shooting movies that will then play back at a quarter of the speed. But if you wanted to do a time-lapse movie in camera, then you'd just set the slow and quick setting to 1 frame per second. That would create a movie that played back at 24, 25, or 30 frames per second, and that would massively speed up what is happening in front of the camera. So clouds would scoot across the sky exceptionally quickly, and people in a cityscape would zoom around like little ants. So yes, we can already do the time-lapse movies in camera, but what this intervalometer time-lapse feature, which will come into the firmware, will enable us to do is to create stills that we can assemble as time-lapse movies in post-production. So Maggie says, so at the moment you have to hold the IAF button. Yes, in AFS, single focus mode, what the camera does is it finds the face. A little green square appears momentarily and then disappears from the screen. Just confirmation that it found the face, but it also found the eye in the face. Sometimes the little green square appears and disappears so quickly, a lot of people didn't even notice that it had found the IAF. But what the changed functionality now is in AFS mode, the little green square will stay illuminated on the face. I'm not actually sure whether that's a sensible idea, to be honest, because if you move or the model then moves, you won't have critical sharpness, even though the fact that you've got the little green square stuck on your screen, that's basically locked the focus at that point in time. Good for static portraits perhaps, but not good for me at an event where I'm moving and the subjects are moving. I would also recommend you keep the minimum shutter speed high in those instances if your subject is moving. Typically, I won't shoot a moving portrait with a shutter speed lower than 1/160th of a second. Even though I can hand hold the camera much slower, I will keep the shutter speeds reasonably high if I'm moving or the model's moving. What happens with the new firmware upgrade, though, is you don't have to hold any custom button. At the moment, when you've assigned IAF to a button, you have to hold that button down all of the time. And because that's a requirement, typically I've assigned that to the focus hold button on the lens. Now, not all lenses have a focus hold button. The Zeiss design lenses don't have focus hold buttons. Pretty much all of the G and GM lenses and the 85 1.8 has a focus hold button, and it's a very comfortable place for your thumb just to keep that focus hold button pressed all of the time. But that requirement after April for A7R3 users and A7 III users will go away because IAF will stay on all of the time. IAF will acquire a new menu feature. It will be in the face priority group of settings. This will allow you to choose whether to choose the left eye or the right eye, or have it left to auto. I would recommend leaving it to auto. Generally, what the camera will try and do 90% of the time is select the leading eye. So if the figure turns towards profile view or three-quarter view, it will always go for the eye that's closest to the camera. This is the most natural looking focus point, not the far eye. Occasionally it will jump to the far eye if the near eye is in deep shadow or there's hair in front of that eye, but typically it will go for that eye. You can set up a new custom button to toggle between left and right eye. Not too sure how often I will want to do that either, but we get that degree of functionality now. I'm actually pleased that the IAF will actually appear as a menu item at all, because when newcomers who have heard about IAF come to the Sony system, they go through all of the menus and can't find it. And they see a menu item called iFocus, which is a feature called that is used with legacy A-mount lenses, which is not IAF. And so often they're hunting through the menus and I can't simply find it. It is typically assigned to the center button by default. And you can typically only find it by going to the custom key menus with older firmware upgrades, and obviously that will change in April as well. And so most photographers will reassign it to the AEL button, the AF on button, or the focus hold button. I typically reassign the center button on most of my cameras to focus standard, and maybe I'll talk about why I do that on a future date. Okay, so we've hit the 1 hour. Hopefully I could probably talk for the Olympics. So but I do need to go now. I've got another shoot planned. And so what I'll do is I'll answer any questions. If you're watching a recording of this live Q&A, if you've got a question, just drop it down. I'll revisit the recording of the movie once a week, and just make sure I clear any questions that have arisen from what I've said during this movie. Okay, so I'm off to Japan for CP Plus on Wednesday this week, and you might see some posts on my social media forums if I get time. I do have a model shoot planned. Bizarrely, I'm thinking of prioritizing Chinatown in Yokohama, which is a bit weird because I'll be in Japan, but I'm looking for, again, I'm prioritizing Boca in the background, would you believe? And a lot of the parks and temples apparently have restrictions on tripods. I was going to look at doing a composite shot, so I might go tripod in a street in Chinatown in Yokohama. Well, that's the plan. Things might change on the day, of course. Okay, so thanks for bearing with me, and I'll catch you online next time. Okay, thanks for watching.